And I know I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If you're an operator and you don't have a standard terms of service or a standard um, kind of master purchase agreement for use with your vendors, I strongly encourage you to give that some thought, because as these things become more drawn out, it's really critically important to have everything defined in terms of the nature of that business relationship. And I think the days of handshake deals, or I know it's still going on where folks are closing deals on Instagram. Probably not the most prudent way to do business these days, when it's becoming more and more challenging from a collection standpoint and an accounts receivable standpoint to make sure that you are getting paid for your product and your services. Welcome to A Higher Law, a cannabis podcast from the Dykema Law Firm. I'm your co-host, John Fraser, Michigan team leader of Dykema's Cannabis Group.
And I'm Lance Boldrey, leader of Dykema's Cannabis Group. For more episodes, you can find us at dykemapodcast.com, youtube.com/dykemalaw, or by searching A Higher Law wherever you get your podcasts.
On today's episode, we'll be recapping the year that was, 2023, and looking ahead to what 2024 has in store for the cannabis industry. We had a lot to talk about in 2023, so let's go ahead and dive in. I think the thing on just about every single cannabis operator's mind when they look back on 2023 has been economic issues, as the market has continued to evolve and mature. And not unlike every other industry that's feeling the pressures of inflation and the Fed's response to inflation to hike interest rates, the cannabis industry, I think, surprisingly for those outside, but unsurprisingly for those inside of the industry, have felt a lot of those effects. Lance, what did you see in 2023 as it relates to how the economics of the cannabis industry have evolved over time?
A lot of bloodbaths, frankly. I mean, 2023 was a horrible year for many folks in the cannabis industry. I think everybody's glad that it's over with and looking forward to 2024. Certainly what we saw in states, particularly states where there is no cap on licenses or where there's a significant unlicensed market, we saw real price compression within the licensed market. Prices coming down at the wholesale level and at the retail level as well, to rates that really make the customer feel great, but not so good for those who are trying to produce and sell cannabis products.
It's a great time to be a cannabis customer. I think that's about the best way of describing the cannabis industry in an economics perspective. And obviously, these businesses, we've talked over and over again about the barriers that are caused by federal illegality of the product. And I think one of the things where you see that most profoundly is in the ways that these businesses have to pivot when they are facing severe economic pressure. Given that there is no availability of federal bankruptcy, we saw an increase in the number of state receiverships as kind of the last ditch effort that cannabis companies have to go to try to preserve their assets and salvage what's left of the value of the company. And in Michigan, we saw our largest cannabis company, in a surprising move, file for receivership in March of 2023. Lance, going back in time, what were your big thoughts when you heard the news that Skymint had filed for receivership?
Frankly, I wasn't that surprised. What I was surprised by more than anything was the amount of capital that had been infused and invested into that business on business projections that, as we see them laid out in some of the court documents, simply didn't make sense, particularly in a declining price environment. We had plenty of folks in Michigan who came in at the time that Michigan legalized medical for sort of commercial use, for a commercial market. People came in saying, hey, it's $3,000 a pound in the illicit market. I've got the best grower ever, because, of course, every grower is the best grower ever. And I'm going to get that $3,000 a pound all day long, and it's only going to go up. When you only had to look at Colorado and Washington, other states that were ahead of us on the curve, to see what was actually going to happen. Was that price of $3,000 a pound was going to drop down to sub 1,000. We also saw a lot of that in the distillate market as well. Michigan is far from alone in seeing a fair amount of distillate come into the legal market that's manufactured through conversion of hemp and CBD. That's a problem for the licensed operators when all of a sudden you're trying to compete with somebody who's selling for lower than your production costs. At the same time, you had, as you mentioned earlier, the interest rate issue. I mean, the capital markets, the markets for cannabis investors, for cannabis investment really dried up largely last year. I mean, we still successfully concluded some capital raises, but it was definitely a different year last year. And we also saw a real distinction between states too, right? I mean, those states that have capped the number of licenses were able to maintain relatively high prices, where those like Michigan or California, where there's no real cap or a thriving illicit market, really had enormous loss of profitability to the extent that these companies were profitable to begin with. So I'm not overly surprised by Skymint. I think they're not necessarily the canary in the coal mine, because I think we'd already seen those canaries, but they're the biggest yet, and I think they are to some extent a harbinger of things to come.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it serves as a kind of a good reminder of these kind of broader macroeconomic trends, and that a lot of the capital that was raised by Skymint was, a couple of years ago when capital was very cheap. We had a lot of very strong economy. The inflation was going, a little bit crazy, but cash was everywhere and it was cheaply available. And then when that dries up, the ability to refinance or to do anything productive with it kind of goes out the window. And without bankruptcy as a safeguard, kind of at the mercy of your creditors, unless you can sort things out through a receivership or get saved through a lucrative M&A transaction that at least preserves some of the value for the founders of the company. So that's
Yeah, I agree. And there's somewhat of a domino effect too. I mean, the other thing that we've certainly seen, as we've seen particularly some of these bigger companies fail, those suppliers who are overly reliant maybe on that company are going to run into issues as well. We're seeing a lot of slow pay and no pay in the industry, to the extent that we've seen regulators in different states now say they're going to start looking at whether cannabis companies are paying their bills as part of the decision to relicense those businesses.
and I know I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If you're an operator and you don't have a standard terms of service or a standard um, kind of master purchase agreement for use with your vendors, I strongly encourage you to give that some thought, because as these things become more drawn out, it's really critically important to have everything defined in terms of the nature of that business relationship. And I think the days of handshake deals, or I know it's still going on where folks are closing deals on Instagram. Probably not the most prudent way to do business these days, when it's becoming more and more challenging from a collection standpoint and an accounts receivable standpoint to make sure that you are getting paid for your product and your services.
Yeah, and John, I wonder what you're seeing. If you could tell us a little bit about what you're seeing as an impact of the economic pressures that the industry is facing. Is there still ongoing investment into new businesses? Are you seeing more consolidation or mergers? What sort of activities are we really seeing out there in the marketplace?
The new investment is limited. The only places I'm seeing investment continuing into new operations are folks that were way too far down the rabbit hole before the market consolidated, and it doesn't make economic sense to walk away from a project when you're on the precipice of opening a new facility. So you might as well finish the thing and see if you can make it work. And I'm hopeful all those folks will find a way, but the math isn't super promising for them. Otherwise, we are seeing a lot of M&A activity continuing to be the point where it's we're not profitable at this size, but if we keep eating enough other fish, maybe as we're a larger fish, we can figure out the economics at scale. And I think that'll continue to be a trend over time here. There certainly is a lot of scalable savings that can be had, especially for these smaller growers when it comes to being able to put all the back office and admin and management and spread it across a larger operating business seems to make some sense. But the only place we're seeing significant new investment generally has been on the retail side in attractive retail markets that don't have convenient service, and there's a demand there. Other than that, on the manufacturing side, we're not seeing it, and that's kind of where things stand. And folks that are looking to get into this space now, you'll have an opportunity to participate if that's what you'd like to do. I think by way of buying distressed assets, I think we are going to see in 2024 and beyond distressed assets available for sale for pennies on the dollar for folks that want to take a chance and try their hand at operating one of these businesses. But obviously that comes with risk because you're buying a business that failed. And so if they failed, there's a chance you might as well.
Yeah, I think maybe, for a lot of those companies, right sizing the debt through receivership is ultimately going to be the pathway to survival. I guess the other place we are seeing investment, though, is where we've seen some happy news in 2023, and that's new states coming online, in some cases with limited markets, in other cases with a more open licensing scheme. What did you really see in terms of new markets in 2023, John?
So we have three new states in 2023: Ohio, Minnesota, and Delaware. The last of those two, Minnesota and Delaware, doing it legalization by way of the legislative process, and Ohio legalizing by way of voter initiative this past November. And so those are going to be Ohio and Minnesota probably more so than Delaware just because of the population dynamics there. But certainly Ohio is going to be an attractive market given the population size there and the fact that you've got multiple different urban clusters between Cleveland, Toledo, Cincinnati, and Columbus, where retail can do, I think, probably really quite well, and in a more limited license state like Ohio is set up to be. Minnesota is another one that's going to be very, very interesting to see how it plays out. Minnesota is kind of an interesting state as well because of how they've regulated or maybe not regulated low THC beverages, and so there have been some cannabis related products that have been available for retail sale even prior to their legalization. But Minnesota and Ohio are probably not likely to have commercial retail sales until maybe the fourth quarter of 2024, but more likely those will be stories to look at as to how those markets are doing in 2025. And 2024 will prominently be focused on folks positioning themselves to invest in those markets as opposed to operations actually launching in those particular states.
Sure. What about at the federal level? I think we had a pretty good year there too.
Interesting, I think, is maybe the way to say, because good would suggest that something concrete actually occurred, but two really significant pieces of information and developments at the federal level. And we talked about one of them previously, in that the Department of Health and Human Services recommended that DEA reschedule cannabis from being a Schedule I drug. In all likelihood, that would mean if accepted by DEA, that it would be rescheduled to Schedule III. No further action has occurred publicly on that. DEA is presumably still in the process of reviewing the HHS petition and evaluating it, and since it was sent over and publicly disclosed in August of this year. So if that happens, if marijuana is rescheduled to Schedule III, 280E becomes a thing of the past, by and large. That would be a boon to all the existing operators and probably to the capital markets as well. I think this industry becomes far more investable, and you may even see publicly traded cannabis companies get listing on exchanges. So that's a big one, and that's something certainly we'll be watching for in 2024 as well. The other really significant piece of federal news is the movement in the Senate on safer banking. Safe banking, the Safe Banking Act has passed the House of Representatives. I always forget the number. I want to say it's about 6 or 7 previous times. And it's always died out in the Senate because under the previous Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, um, not a particular advocate for legalizing marijuana or taking any kind of a different federal posture with respect to marijuana, didn't want to bring that up to the floor for a vote. And now we have seen Majority Leader Schumer commit to bringing the Safer Banking Act to the Senate floor for a vote. You would think, because it's passed the House on several other prior occasions, that if it were to pass the Senate, it would become law. But certainly the composition of the House has changed over time here. And obviously we had pretty significant dysfunction occur in the House of Representatives with that now former Speaker McCarthy being ousted and the Republicans going through a series of nominations and votes to eventually leave us with Speaker Mike Johnson. And I've not seen any public statements or sentiments as to what Speaker Johnson's position is on the Safe Banking Act, or whether this is something that would continue to be a policy priority in this session of the Congress. And so I know that'll be another one to watch very closely in 2024 is what if anything, is going to happen there.
Yeah, well, turning to 2024 and what, if anything, is going to happen, certainly the DEA action on the HHS recommendation is the big one, potentially. As we talked about in our prior podcast covering the federal rescheduling process, the last time that a substance was rescheduled from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, it took about 11 years. So this could be a very lengthy process, but at the end of the day, this is almost certainly a politically driven process. So if the politics line up right above DEA, it's possible that could move forward. What about other states, John, that are as we look forward to 2024?
So I think the big one that has kind of been on the radar for a number of years now has been Florida. And Florida's been at it to try to legalize, right, Florida's already a medical state, but moving to legalize adult use has been moving forward with the ballot initiative for some time. And the organizers there have been challenged at more or less every single turn legally in terms of getting it on the ballot. And now the Florida Supreme Court is poised to decide whether or not the ballot should be placed. The question of whether or not to legalize adult use marijuana in the state of Florida should go to the voters. Obviously, I think if it makes it to the voters, it seems predetermined that it will pass given the popularity and the way that marijuana legalization polls in the state. So the linchpin question will be, will the Florida Supreme Court move that issue to the ballot? I believe oral arguments were held very recently. I believe they were held last month. So an opinion from the Florida Supreme Court should be coming out in the very near future. Other states to look at in 2024, Nebraska. Nebraska is on the radar for a possible ballot initiative for a constitutional amendment to allow marijuana. South Dakota is at it again. South Dakota has tried a number of times now to legalize marijuana at the ballot and actually did pass a marijuana ballot initiative. I believe in 2022 it was overruled, though, by the South Dakota Supreme Court. So the expectation is if any procedural legal issues are cleared up, that would pass again. Other states that you're looking at, Lance, for 2024?
Wisconsin, and that's the big one for a number of our Michigan operators. There's been some very interesting media stories in 2023 over the raft of lawsuits and litigation, the weed wars in the western Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where you actually had the former Attorney General of the state of Michigan arguing in a brief that what created the market up there and what would sustain his client is all the folks coming in from other states, coming across the border from Wisconsin. Wisconsin, for a long time, it's been sort of a standoff between The Democrats in the legislature and Governor Evers, who've supported adult use, and Republicans who've been, maybe reluctantly, but have been willing to support a more limited medical framework. That looks like that logjam may have broken. Just last week, the governor said that he would be amenable to a Republican initiative that would simply authorize medical use of marijuana. So I think there's a very good chance we'll see something in Wisconsin there. I'm not sure I share entirely your rosy outlook with respect to Florida. I do think there's a strong possibility that it would pass, adult use would pass if it passes the legal hurdles and gets on the ballot. But don't forget, in Florida, it takes a 60% affirmative vote for the constitutional amendment that would authorize that. So it's far from a done deal. Are there other federal legislative issues that we expect to see next year? Why don't we talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, one issue that has been percolating and hasn't received probably the amount of national attention as safer banking has been the federal farm bill, and cannabis activists probably weren't paying a ton of attention to the federal farm bill until 2014, and then following 2018 when 2014 legalized hemp for research purposes, and then 2018 more broadly legalized hemp and hemp products. And so the farm bill is typically renewed on a 5-year basis. So the farm bill was set to expire at the end of 2023, and it was renewed as kind of a stopgap measure up until September of 2024. But I think the expectation out of Congress is that they'll take action on the farm bill sooner than later. And obviously now we have the benefit, or at least the benefit of hindsight, of the effects of the 2018 farm bill with respect to how it legalized hemp and things that they might want to do differently in the renewal package. And certainly we would expect some changes to be made, and the extent and the gravity of those changes are still a complete wide open question mark. But certainly the folks in the hemp industry have been pushing for a change in the definition of hemp to grant them increased leeway, because right now it's that 0.3% definition becomes really challenging on the cultivation side to maintain the crop at that point all the way through its life cycle, as it's going to spike during flower. But more broadly, I think the big kind of elephant in the room that emerged following the 2018 hemp bill is all the intoxicating hemp-derived cannabinoids that have now made their way to the market. Delta 8, Delta 10, THCA, you name it. Somebody's found a way to bring it to market and is advertising it as federally legal hemp products, despite the fact that they're intoxicating, or I don't know. Yeah, prior to the federal hemp bill, you probably would have called them analogs to THC and treated them, and folks would have been prosecuted for selling them in that same fashion. And so certainly something probably will be done to address those in some way, shape, or form. And your guess is as good as mine, Lance, on what that actually looks like.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the real fight. And I think we saw in Michigan several years ago, the legislature got ahead of the Delta 8 issue by defining THC more broadly for distinguishing between hemp and marijuana. So great. That just means instead of different tetrahydrocannabinols, you use HHC, or you find all these other cannabinoids. I think you said the 2018 Farm Bill changed things. The 2018 Farm Bill for me, I'd never heard of many of these minor cannabinoids before. And now we're seeing them compete with the regulated industry. I think there are some in the hemp industry who, certainly don't see that as the best path forward, but I think they're in the minority. There's a lot of operators now that are using these hemp loopholes to sell highly intoxicating, unregulated product across into many, many states.
Yeah, I mean, and without making any kind of moral judgments, it's just an interesting quandary that we find ourselves in, that you can have products that by all accounts, more or less do the same thing as Delta 9 THC, that can be sold anywhere with no licensure, no age verification. None of the ordinary types of things you would expect with an intoxicating product, and I think the current status quo is just unlikely to persist given those kind of basic fundamental things. The notion that everybody's going to operate on the Scouts honor system and promise, pinky promise that they won't sell to anybody under the age of 18 or 21 without a legal requirement to do so. Uh, Probably rightly is a concern for most parents, I would think, but maybe I'm in the minority on that issue.
No, I don't think you are. It's funny. I had a colleague of mine from law school reach out a couple of months ago because she'd found a Delta 8 vape pen in her son's room, and he said, "No, no, no, it's hemp." And she said, "Well, let me call Lance and ask about this." And frankly, what I told her was, I'd much rather my high school senior be smoking flower from a bong than smoking this Delta 8 product that Lord knows where he got it, and Lord knows what's in it.
Yeah, and it's the Scouts honor system too that it's even Delta 8. I'd be curious. If you put these to the peer reviewed lab test, what actually the chemical composition is at the end of the day, and whether there's any residual solvents or any of those other things. I'm taken back a couple of years. You'll recall the vitamin E acetate vaping crisis that swept not just Michigan but a number of other states as well, where folks were smoking unregulated product that was cut with vitamin E acetate, and there was the horrible story out of Detroit of the young man who needed a double lung transplant as a result of the damage done to his lungs by vaping this product. So, not to be hyper alarmist, but we've seen this story play out before, and it's something I think being dismissive of is probably inappropriate.
And it's one more place where we see that sort of push and pull between between more of the activist community, or those who want government completely out of the process, and those who've embraced the licensed industry and are now leaning on it for protectionism.
So let's wrap up too with discussion of obviously 2024 is an election year. I don't know if anybody's heard this, but we've been on the campaign trail for the next presidential election since before we finished up the 2020 presidential election. And so, Lance, what are your thoughts as far as what we'll see, following this November's election as it relates to the cannabis industry?
I am not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. If you think I certainly don't think the behavior of the candidates is predictable, particularly when it comes to a second term. So, I'll continue to watch from the sidelines and continue to work with my Canadian clients in the event that I need a geographic escape.
And I think that's a point well taken, in that by and large, during the Trump presidency in 2016, and even under the Biden presidency, very little has practically changed, if anything, at the federal level. And I know there was obviously, I recall when Trump named Jeff Sessions his attorney general, and Attorney General Sessions rescinded the Cole memorandum. We thought that might be a really significant negative impact to the industry, and by and large, really didn't change too much of anything. So that's a point well taken there. I guess one thing I'd note is a lot of attention is always paid to the top of the ticket, and I would say that's obviously very important. But those down ballot races, those House seats, those Senate seats that are up for election this year, what happens in Congress may be perhaps probably more important for 2025 and beyond than who holds the Oval Office, in terms of what actually makes its way to the president's desk for consideration. And so those will be interesting to watch as those races materialize.
So I guess to recap, John, 2023 was a year of lots of changes and unpredictability, and 2024 is shaping up to be the same.
I don't think we'd want it any other way, though, right?
It does keep life interesting.
Well, that's it for us today. Thanks very much for listening. As always, you can find us at dykemapodcast.com, youtube.com/Dykema Law, or by searching A Higher Law wherever you get your podcasts. I'm John Fraser.
And I'm Lance Boldrey, and we look forward to seeing you next time on A Higher Law.